The earth dries up and withers. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants. Desolation is left in the city. The streams will be turned into pitch and the soil to sulphur. The land will become burning pitch. Night and day it will not be quenched. From generation to generation it will lie waste. Thorns will grow and nettles and thistles. It will be the haunt of jackals. Do you think those words might be from a climate change action manifesto? They certainly sound like it, but they're actually from the prophet Isaiah in chapters 24 and 34. Isaiah paints a picture of what will happen to the earth if the people lose touch with God. It's in the context of the people of Israel heading into exile, which would have been after 587 BC, after the fall of Jerusalem. They headed into exile at the hands of the Babylonians, with war waging all around them. Very similar, really, to the exile of the current refugees from Syria and other countries. A whole people moving en masse, not just a few people needing to leave their homes, but a whole people needing to move and being sent into exile. The words of utter desolation of the people and the lands laid waste that Isaiah says sound very current. And then all of a sudden in Isaiah we have the passage that Casper read for us this morning. The tone changes to one of hope. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom. All of a sudden in the middle of desolation you get these beautiful words of hope. Many scholars think that the editors of Isaiah put this passage in the wrong place. It seems to belong with the later chapters of Isaiah, from chapter 40 on, which are all hopeful passages about the return from exile, the ones that we know from music, comfort, comfort ye my people. So these words that we heard this morning, people think they're in the wrong place. But Barbara Lundblad says, Isaiah dares to speak a word out of place, a word that refused to wait until things actually improved. While these words don't seem to belong, they show us that it was the prophet's job to name both the despair of the current situation and the hope for the future. And so, in the same breath, we've got desolation and hope. The writers and the prophets of the Old Testament were always firmly grounded in their understanding of God as creator of the earth and creator of people. And then to tend the earth and to care for it was the task of the people. That's what they were created for. And if the earth was suffering, well, it must be because people had failed in their duty to God. Old Testament people saw a line of cause and effect from the actions of the people here, and the actions of God towards the earth. The people did one thing, God did another. Now, we would no longer say that the rivers have dried up because God is punishing the people for their wicked ways. But we do understand that our actions do lead directly to the drying up of rivers or the rising of sea levels. The rising of sea levels to an extent where our brothers and sisters in the Pacific Islands are at risk for their very lives. Isaiah and the people of his time instinctively understood that actions have consequences. And now, of course, we have climate change science to show that they were right. The prophets in their time were not supposed to be predicting the future, but naming the reality of the present. But in this case, they seem to have predicted the future as well. Isaiah dares to speak a word out of place, a word that refuses to wait until things improve. It's when people speak words out of place that change happens. At the recent film festival, we went to see a depressing documentary called Merchants of Doubt. Some of you might have seen it. It's a documentary about both the tobacco industry, first of all, and then about climate change and how the various messages get twisted and used by different groups according to their own interest. From the climate change perspective, it traced how the world has gradually shifted to understand the science of climate change and how the early deniers who claimed science was on their side were in fact usually not scientists. And how it told us about the early lone voice of James Hansen, one of the very well-known scientists today, how his voice has now become the norm of the climate change debate. He was one who in the early days dared to speak a word out of place, and now people are listening. In our gospel reading today, we have the story of Jesus' encounter with the unnamed Syro-Phoenician woman. Remember that Jesus, as a Jewish man, would not normally interact directly with any woman, a rule he broke all the time, and certainly not with a Gentile that is a non-Jewish woman. And so he responds to her request for healing for her daughter with a very rude and derogatory reply, "Let the children be fed first," meaning the children of Israel. He says it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs, meaning she's a dog. She is the one then who speaks the word out of place and talks back to him, and she says, well, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs from under the table. And her word out of place changes Jesus' mind, and he heals her daughter. She speaks out, she protests, she names the reality of the divisions between Jew and Gentile, man and woman. She protests and change happens. And this story of healing is not really told by Mark to recount the individual personal story of this woman and her daughter. Mark tells it to make a much bigger point about breaking down the divisions and about the new way that the community of followers of Jesus was going to have to be. Even Jesus had to be challenged in order to break out of that exclusive mold that was the norm for his time. And so the new community of followers are going to have to do the same. They're going to have to be brave enough to break down the barriers that they found in their communities, Jew and Gentile, men and women, slave and free. And the same is true in the healing that comes after that, the healing of the man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. The language that Mark uses in telling this story echoes the language of our Isaiah passage. The eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, the tongue of the speechless shall sing for joy. And that's exactly what happens as Mark recounts the story. And any of Mark's readers would recognise the language from Isaiah and make the link from that one individual healing to the healing of the earth that Isaiah is speaking of. The tongue of the speechless shall sing for joy, and the waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The personal healing of the man and the healing of the earth are all the same. They are all part of the great dream and vision of the kingdom, the realm of God. And the healing comes about when someone speaks a word out of place. The prophet Isaiah in the midst of the doom of the exile, the woman rejected by Jesus, the man who could not speak, but his friends hoped he might. We've got plenty of people speaking up about the refugee crisis and calling on the leaders of all the nations to act, and maybe our own leaders are listening. At our diocesan synod over the last couple of days, we talked about the refugee crisis and called on our government to double the refugee quota, as many are doing. It's very much time that we speak that word out of place. And as a world, as we're heading towards the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris in December, and as the world continues to warm up, we're looking for leaders who will speak, who will name the reality of where the world is and give us ways to act for change and give us hope that we can change. And sometimes the key to change is not just to paint doom and gloom, but to give people hope and even some certainty that if we change our ways, it will have an impact and it will be worth the effort. We all have to encourage each other in that. We all have to encourage each other in believing that the things that we can do will make a difference. And for us as people of faith, the ground that we stand on when we're doing that, the ground we stand on when we're looking at environmental issues, is the heritage of our thousands of years of understanding of our relationship with our Creator and our relationship with the earth. The earth suffers when we forget our sacred duty to care for it and not to abuse it. The earth flourishes when we are in tune with our Creator and creation. It's not by chance that the very opening words of our Bible are, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth." But that's actually next week's reading and next week's sermon. In the meantime, as Archbishop Tudu said, we are called to love the earth as much as God does.